August 28th, 2025. With the agents of infection focused on this place's main entrance and most of my biomass cultivating elsewhere, I very quickly dismissed the notion of a frontal assault. These attacker cells already appeared rather volatile, so panicking them into greater erratics with an obvious attack seemed like a rather poor choice. Scanning the structure's exterior, my eyes quickly fell upon a section of the roof lined with flimsy glass. Extending a tendril of my biomass and hooking it onto a concrete outcropping, I hoisted myself up onto the top of this building. Careful to avoid drawing attention from the attacking cells below, I crept toward the nearest transparent section and carefully wrenched it open with my malleable fingers, allowing me to slip inside without any unnecessary noise. Landing upon a patchwork of metal beams near the roof, I scanned the area beneath me in order to get my bearings. Dozens of walled alcoves, each bearing a different word or name, lined the sides of this extensive area. From what the immune cells had said, there were at least 6 hostile agents within this place. All around the extensive place, I saw unarmed humans scrambling to find cover from the gunmen. Robust as it was, I found the human form unsuitable for this task, and so I shifted my body into something leaner and more predatory, forming sharp teeth and long claws. 3 loud bands reverberated through the building, followed by a scream and a yelp. Triangulating the source of this noise and navigating around a corner towards its source, I discovered the first of the gunmen strutting down the hall towards an injured victim struggling to crawl away. For a moment I was once again taken aback by how pathetic this attacker seemed. Wielding a weapon much the same as those used against me back at the lab, this human thought themselves an apex predator. Perhaps it is easy to make such a miscalculation when one has not come face to face with the real thing. Judging by their stiff movements, this one seemed to lack the discipline I'd seen in others. If I attacked them without prelude, there was a reasonable chance they would fire out of reflex and finish off the victim. Carefully restructuring my vocal cords, I conjured a deep, echoing chitter from the back of my throat. Immediately, the hostile cells spun around to face behind them, their weapons swiveling wildly in search of the source. "What the fuck?" they murmured under their breath, something I could easily pick up with my sharpened senses. Not wanting to give this agent a chance to scream, I leapt down from my vantage point and landed just behind them, batting the weapon from their grip and wrapping a tendril around their throat in a single swift motion. The attacker clawed fruitlessly at my biomass in an attempt to free themselves. These efforts quickly ceased, however, when with a flex of my cells, I tightened the loop and shut their windpipe for good. Turning around to regard their victim, I saw them staring at me with tentative horror. "Do not be afraid," I commanded the stranger, approaching them slowly so as not to startle. It looked like they wanted to run away, but their injuries precluded such action. Sticky red liquid pooled from the human's leg and torso, soaking the otherwise pristine white floor beneath them. Humans were not constructed to sustain the wounds this one had suffered. Without immediate rectification of the injury, it was unlikely they would survive. That being said, I had not the time to carry them out of the building, as others would surely suffer if I did. If only this human possessed my regenerative abilities. The notion bounced between my cells for a moment before quickly coalescing into an idea. Holding up one of my claws and restructuring it into a hollow needle, I carefully inserted the makeshift syringe into the human's torso wound and injected a few of my own cells. Then, much like I had done with the sewer cells back in Fargo, I assigned these foreign agents a task: to keep the body alive while preserving its form and functions, especially those of the brain, as much as possible. The expression of this human, a female if their hormone levels were any indication, shifted throughout the process from terror to confusion, before finally landing on awe as their wounds began to close. "Go and hide!" I instructed this human, who could now at least stagger through one of the shop doors. With their eyes no longer upon me, I turned toward the gunman's newly vacated corpse and quickly ripped off one of its arms, absorbing it into my central mass before swinging back up to the rafters. Almost immediately upon my absorption of new sustenance, another staccato of gunfire rang out from a shop elsewhere in the atrium. Weaving between the skyward beams, I quickly navigated toward the sound's source. Peering through a shattered window, I saw one of the gunmen firing rounds into a door, his attack accompanied by a chorus of muffled screams behind it. Judging by how the attacker then fumbled with the doorknob, I quickly concluded that the door was blocked to keep the hostile body out. Quietly leaping down onto the floor and crawling through the window, I crept up behind the hostile cell. Ultimately, however, a momentary lapse in my caution would result in my body brushing against a shelf and knocking something off. In an instant, the attacker spun around to face me, unloading volley after volley of ammunition into my body. This had minimal effect, of course. The weapons used by humans, I concluded, were by and large meant to take advantage of their hierarchical body structure, disrupting the lumps of specialized cells to prevent them from performing their functions. This was far less effective against more homogeneous entities like myself. Charging up to the gunmen in total disregard for their attempts to harm me, I grabbed them by the neck and unhinged my false jaw to wrap it around their face. The attacker squealed, then fell silent as their necks snapped, severing their body from the brain's signals and rendering it a motionless sack of meat. Swallowing the now dead hostile's head into myself, I steadily approached the blocked door and slapped my hand against it a few times. "Is everyone all right in there?" I called to the humans inside. "Will you all survive until the police arrive?" For a moment there was silence. Then came the whispered debate of frightened humans unsure whether or not to trust me. At last, after a few seconds, a feminine voice piped up. "Our son got shot in the arm. None of us know first aid. Can you help him?" First aid. It was one of the terms I had researched not long ago. It was an emergency ritual conducted by humans to prolong function until proper healing could be administered. I could certainly do better than that. Send him out. I have medical supplies that can help. "How do we know this isn't a trap?" came a harsher, more masculine voice. This was an excellent point. They could not see that I had eliminated the hostile agent, and so it was perfectly reasonable not to want to remove their protective barrier. Understandable as this was, however, I did not have the time to haggle over a single life. Taking a moment to assume a somewhat more human appearance, I made sure to keep the details of my face as far from the usual as I could. Then, extending tendrils from my fingers and wrapping them around the door, I ripped it off of its hinges with a simple tug and twist. Boxes toppled out of the closet in unison with the door, presumably having been what held it shut. "There," I remarked, making sure to return my hand to normal before tossing the door aside. "If I wanted to hurt you, I would. Now please show me the injured one." At first, they did not move, instead simply staring at me with that same pattern of terror to bafflement to reverence that I had seen from the female before. There were 5 humans in that closet, 3 of them larger, including the injured progeny, and 2 smaller, 1 male and 1 female. At last, as their stunned reactions subsided, the still conscious adult male hefted the bleeding one and paid him at my feet. "He's going to bleed out!" the man all but shouted. "You said you can help." "Indeed," I nodded in the human gesture of confirmation, pretending to reach into a back pocket as I formed one of my fingernails into a needle, and keeping my hand tightly closed so as not to reveal the syringe's source, injected another small piece of myself into this human's injured arm. After a few seconds, the young man's eyes squinted open and he steadily rose to his feet. "Who are you?" the older female asked, her voice quivering slightly as she spoke to me. "Remain here," I told the family, ignoring her question as I stalked back out into the open in search of the remaining aggressors. Effective as my attacks undoubtedly were, the speed at which I was dispatching attackers left something to be desired. If I was going to prevent as much damage as possible, I needed to bolster my pace. Returning to the skylights and peering down once more upon the chaos, I saw 2 more gunmen firing down from the 2nd floor at a small group of scattering humans. Suddenly, a blur of movement drew my vision a few meters from the gunmen, where a young human had made the mistake of attempting to run for safety. The rightmost gunman noticed not long after I did, and an inexplicable panic flooded my cells as I watched the attacker turn his weapon on the child. I did not possess the required speed to intercept the attack in time. Calling upon my biomass back in Fargo for additional calculation capacity, time seemed to slow to a halt as I pondered what to do. Perhaps a dozen different ideas flitted through my mind in the less than second I had, but eventually I arrived at one that I thought might work. Elongating one of my claws into a spike of calcified biomass and reeling back the arm attached to it, I swung hard the air around me, and with that force, launched the spike 30 meters directly into the attacker's throat. Choked gargling noises spouted from the gunman's mouth as they choked upon their own blood, discarding their weapon onto the ground in favor of clutching at their bleeding neck. Beside them, the other attacker scanned the area frantically in search of what had done this to their fellow malignant agent. When their eyes landed upon me, I saw them recoil in fright for a moment before raising their weapon and firing recklessly in my direction. Most of the bullets did not hit me as I weaved along the rafters toward the standing attacker, and those that did dealt very little damage. Once I had drawn within lunging distance, I launched myself down from the ceiling and landed directly atop the gunman, impaling then through the chest with my elongated claws, piercing their heart before slicing them open down to their stomach. Making my way to the front entrance of the mall, I arrived at an unexpected scene. Sheltering behind the counters of a kiosk was Officer Bissell. Meanwhile, taking shelter behind similar installations, 4 hostile agents fired upon his position. Clearly, the estimation of 6 gunmen was a low ball. As I scanned the area and began to strategize, Bissell fired his weapon toward one of the gunmen, scoring a direct hit and downing them with a single projectile, leaving only 3 left. With the officer once again taking cover to reload, one of the malignant cells, the one who wore a gray cap, stood from their own barricade and bolted off. At the time, I presumed this to be an act of retreat, and as such saw no reason to prioritize them. This assumption, however, proved to be incorrect as the agent returned to the scene with an injured human in tow, holding his weapon to her head. "I've got a hostage!" he shouted, immediately catching the officer's attention. "Drop your gun or I swear to God I'll kill her!" This was not an expected strategy. Were it not being used for such malignant ends, I could almost admire the tactic's simplicity, threatening further damage to a healthy cell in order to dissuade the antibody. Reflexively, Bissell aimed his weapon at the hostage-taker, only to freeze up. This, unfortunately, gave one of the others an opening to fire upon him, the bullet embedding into his shoulder and sending the officer careening to the ground. By this point, I felt that stealth had long overstayed its welcome. With the antibody dealt with, it seemed likely that the gray-capped one would kill the relatively healthy cell. I had to keep them on the defensive to prevent that from happening. Rapidly restructuring my vocal cords to prioritize volume, I let out an inhuman, chittering screech that echoed through the mall. Clearly, this was effective in catching the remaining gunmen's attention, as immediately their movements became tense. "The fuck was that?" the hostage-taker shouted, their weapon leaving the healthy cell in favor of scanning the surrounding area. For a moment, I considered either launching another projectile at the hostage-taker or rushing them directly. However, I wasn't confident enough in my aim to guarantee the victim's safety from such a projectile, and if the other 2 saw me attacking the comrade, they would more than likely fire upon me, potentially striking the victim as a consequence. Leaping down beside the nearest gunman, I let out another bellow from deep within my throat to catch all of their attention before propelling forth toward the gunman next to me and grabbed them by the face with my clawed hand, leaving them just enough time to scream before I crushed their skull. This was effective in gaining the attention of the other 2, as with reckless abandon they fired upon me, the bullets ripping through their now dead fellow malignant's body and dealing minimal damage to myself. With my form foreign and terrifying to them, the gray-capped one did not recognize me as an antibody, and as such did not attempt the same hostage trick as he had used on Bissell. Ripping into the dead body's torso with my teeth for additional biomass, I formed a long tendril from my arm and launched it toward the taller of the 2 remaining attackers, the one who still lived, yet lacked a hostage to protect them. Impaling this one through the arm with my organic harpoon, I yanked them toward me, forcing them to concede their weapon as I drew them into range of my jaws, biting through their skull with a satisfying cruk and leaving behind exposed gray matter. Hostage and hostage-taker alike regarded me with horror as I stood to an inhuman height for intimidation purposes before charging toward them on all 4s. Blinded by terror, the final malignant fired upon me until their weapons ceased to comply. Finally, in a scramble to preserve their own life, they released the hostage from their grip and threw them at me. My efforts to appear as animalistic as possible had paid off, as in mistaking me for a mindless beast, the gray-capped one had surrendered the sole thing keeping him alive. Leaping over the hostage and landing atop this final malignant cell, I wrapped my claws around his head and with a sideways jerk snapped his spinal cord, instantly neutralizing the last attacker. Standing still for a moment in anxious anticipation of another gunshot, my cells relaxed as at last I could hear nothing of the sort. The danger had, at least for the time, subsided. Reassuming my non-primary human form, I turned toward the former hostage, still scrambling on the ground, and I knelt down to offer her my hand. "Apologies for frightening you," I smiled, assisting her to her feet while at the same time scanning her body for significant injuries. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," the human stammered, her eyes locked onto mine as though analyzing the details of my face. Why were you saved me?" Perhaps given a moment or two I might have explained something of myself to her. But the sound of Officer Bissell groaning behind the kiosk immediately snapped me back into action as I sprinted over to administer aid to him. One injection of my cells and a few seconds later the officer was able to stand once more. "What was that?" he asked, flexing the area of his arm where my cells had been injected. I did not answer. Some things, I figured, were best left unsaid. With all of the gunmen dead and sirens blaring outside, the time had arrived for me to take my leave. Retrieving a new, less bullet-ridden set of clothing from a nearby storefront, I swung back up to the skylight and escaped into the open city.